Welcome to the third lecture on the Peloponnesian War. From the Trojan War to the conquest of Alexander the Great, ships and seamanship played a major role in ancient Greece, and the Peloponnesian War was no exception. The polis that controlled the Aegean Sea gained an advantage in the war. In this lecture, we will cover maritime power in ancient Greece, naval tactics, and the Navy's role in the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to use Athens for most of the examples since they had the most proficient navy throughout the 5th century. Access to the sea was important to the Greek civilizations. According to Thucydides, the first king to establish a navy was King Minos of Crete in 1400 BCE. Now, this may be dismissed by many historians as being mythology, but it is clear that Greek seamanship was necessary before the Peloponnesian War, because so many Greek city-states were located on islands. By the 5th century, about 900 years later, access to the sea continued to be very important for major city-states. Athens had the most ships and the most professional navy. And on the Peloponnesian side, Sparta had some ships, but they were not nearly as grand as Athens in quantity or quality. So instead, Sparta had to rely on its allies, mostly Corinth, to provide a navy strong enough to counter Athens. Aside from military usage, Greek ships contributed to their polis in other ways. Access to the sea allowed for greater range of travel. People could reach different areas faster by sea than they could on land. And sea travel was the only way to reach the islands. However, the ship could not travel across the sea in one trip. As you can see here in the Aegean Sea, Athenian ships would have to travel near islands they controlled, and in the Ionian Sea, the ships had to sail along the coast of Greece and Italy. This was done to ensure that the ships would have an area to land at in case of a storm, and it also allowed rowers to rest and resupply on food. Ships were useful for overseas trade. For example, Athenian and Corinthian pottery were exported throughout the entire Mediterranean. And Athens was able to import grain from the central steppes. And this is because their ships could travel through the Hellespont and the Bosphorus into the Black Sea region, and they usually export olive oil, and their pottery would contain those oils. Communication was made easier by sea travel. Envoys from distant regions could travel to city-states to offer trade, request alliances, declare war, or request military assistance. Sea travel also made collecting tribute simpler, in Athens' case at least. Athens was in control of an empire that enthralled most of the inhabited islands of the Aegean Sea by the 5th century. Aside from collecting tribute, they could also send a fleet carrying hoplites to enforce payment from their subjects and put down rebellions, which happened very frequently during the 5th century. As you can see here, they had to travel various distances. They had to travel 300 miles from Euboea through the Hellespont and the Bosphorus to trade for grain. Here, they had to travel over 100 miles from Euboea to the Chalcidice, and usually they'd be traveling there to put down revolts. They had to travel about 425 miles from the Piraeus to the Peloponnesus to Corcyra, and about 400 more miles from Corcyra to Syracuse. Now as for their naval tactics. By the time the Greeks were using pentaconters, these were ships that were wider and flat on top, where 50 rowers, hence the name pentaconter, were used to row the ship, and their troops would be on top. They would park alongside each other, if that's what you call it when you park at sea, along an enemy ship, where they could board the enemy ship and attack them. That was the tactic of the pentaconter vessels. But when the triremes came around, these were referred to as tri because the trireme means three banked. And these were rowers that were rowing from the top level of the ship to the central level to the bottom level. And these were below the ship, and they had a total of about 170 rowers per ship. Their primary tactic was ramming, and each side would use different tactics depending on the ship. The Athenians, their triremes were built more for speed, so they would use tactics referred to as periplus, or sail around, where they would actually try to hit the trireme, just T-bone it, and sink it by splitting right through the middle. The Peloponnesian and Syracusan vessels, on the other hand, packed on much armor and packed the wood much thicker when they built their triremes, so they would ram their opponent's ships head on. Ships could also ground the opposing ship by pulling up alongside it and forcing it along shore, in which case they would usually have their own soldiers prepare to seize the ship for themselves. They would also, when, let's say, they needed to take care of a rebelling city-state or island, they could raid it, siege it, and blockade it by sea by preventing other city-states from transporting other troops or cargo. And the ships were also used for transporting hoplites and supplies to soldiers, like, let's say, during a siege, or even during a battle. During the Peloponnesian War, the Greek navy continued to play an important part in the Greek world. Many refer to Athens and Sparta as the elephant and the whale because it creates sort of a paradox when it comes to how to engage each other. Like, Athens was the biggest maritime power, the biggest sea empire, so it was considered a whale, the mightiest creature in the sea. Sparta, on the other hand, was a major land power, and it had the greatest army in Greece by the 5th century. So they were considered an elephant, the greatest creature on land. The problem that arises from this is, how do you get an elephant and a whale to fight each other if they're not capable of going outside their element? During the war, there were a total of 168 actions by ships. So the Navy played an important role in this. During the Ionian War, which is the last phase of the Peloponnesian War, the majority of military operations occurred at sea or on islands. As a matter of fact, let's go back to the image here. This area here is known as Ionia. This is where most of the battles occurred during the final phase of the Peloponnesian War. Most of them were by sea and on the distant islands that Athens controlled. During the Peloponnesian War, access to the ships allowed the Greek infantry to function as marines because they'd be transported by ships, then set off then dock at the islands where they could disembark and set up a camp or fort where they could continue to hold out their operations. These were also effective during other battles, let's say, for example, the Battle of Sphacteria, where Athens was able to land hundreds of Greek infantry and peltasts onto the island of Sphacteria to attack the Spartans. And they were able to do this from multiple locations, from both the east and the west side of the island. Major expeditions could be carried out at further locations. For example, the Greek expedition to Sicily. The Athenians also carried out an expedition to Egypt during the First Peloponnesian War, and during the end of the Persian Wars, they were able to carry out expeditions to Byzantium, which is in the northern section of what we now refer to as Asia Minor. And that was located in the Persian Empire. Now, as for our possession for all time, we're going to do a comparison of Athens to other major sea powers, of some things they have in common. And what we're going to do is compare 5th century Athens to 17th to 21st century England and 19th to 21st century United States. Athens was located on a peninsula, and the region referred to as Attica had exposure on the sea, to the sea on 3 sides. England is an island, so it's got exposure to the sea all around it. And U.S. is referred to what Alfred Thayer Mahan calls an insular nation, or island nation, if you will, because it has exposure to the sea on the east, west, and southeast. The importance of developing a strong navy in Athens was put forth by an Athenian general named Themistocles, who was a prominent general, and he actually played a huge role in the Persian Wars. He led the naval campaign at Artemisium and later Salamis. In America and England, a man by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan stressed the importance of sea power for these nations, and I highly recommend, if you want to find out more about what he stressed, I would highly recommend his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1805. It's a very good read. At Athens, during the 5th century, they would be transporting hoplites by ship to rebellious city-states. They did this many times. This happened very frequently. And England and the U.S. did the same thing. In 1689 to 1691, the 9 Years' War broke out between France and England, and during this time, the deposed King of England went to Ireland because he supported the French King Louis XIV, and after he was removed from office, he led the Irish to revolt against England, and the English had to send their soldiers there to put down the revolt. This was referred to as the Williamite War. For the U.S., in 1915 and 1916, they had to transport U.S. Marines to Haiti during what was referred to as the First Cacos War. Cacos were mercenaries. The Cacos were threatening the lives of U.S. citizens located in Haiti. And last but not least, Athens during the 5th century protected their vital shipping route in the Hellespont because it was vital for them to get grain to Athens. And that was the best way they could do it. They go through the Hellespont, and the Scythian-controlled, what we now know today as Ukraine, had a lot of grain back then. So they could get it in bulk at the time. England would have to use their ships to protect their interests in the Suez Canal, which gained them access from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And the U.S. had to use their navy to protect the Panama Canal, which was the only passage they had that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. I hope everyone's enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them in the chat. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay awesome. I will see you next time.